Coworker tried to get me fired over breast implants, so I pulled a reverse card. 4 years ago, I was 24 years old, and life threw me a curveball that would change everything. My mum had passed away from breast cancer, and to say that it left a hole in my heart would be an understatement. She had been strong, brave. Her death had a profound impact on me, especially because both of my grandmothers had also passed away from breast cancer. The fear that this genetic curse might affect me too loomed large over my mind. So I made an appointment with a specialist to get screened. The news was terrifying but not entirely unexpected. I had some cells in my breast tissue that could become cancerous at any point. The risk was high, and with my family history, there was no guarantee that the cells wouldn't develop into cancer. I was given a few options. 1, regular screenings every 3 minutes for a month. The doctor warned that this was the most wait-and-see approach. It could be years before the cells developed into cancer, or they could stay dormant forever. This meant regular checkups that would never end and could still result in a cancer diagnosis at any point. 2, a single mastectomy. This would involve removing the breast with the problematic cells but still require constant monitoring of the other breast. 3, a bilateral mastectomy. This was the option I chose. It meant removing all of my breast tissue, essentially eliminating the risk of developing cancer. It was drastic, but after watching my mother suffer and ultimately lose her battle, I knew I couldn't take the chance. I went into the surgery with a sense of finality, but that didn't mean the process would be easy. The scarring was supposed to be minor, but it wasn't. The scars were jagged bright pink, and left me feeling like a stranger in my own body. I went into a deep depression. I wouldn't leave my apartment, and I couldn't bear to look at myself in the mirror. I became physically ill at the thought of seeing myself naked or even just seeing my chest. It felt like a constant reminder of my fear and trauma. I knew I needed help, so I sought out therapy. The therapist was understanding and suggested I see a plastic surgeon to explore ways to reduce the scarring. The options included laser treatments and creams, neither of which worked. The scars remained, and my self-esteem continued to plummet. Finally, the surgeon suggested implants to both conceal the scars and restore some sense of normalcy to my appearance. I opted for breast implants. My natural size had been an F cup, so I went with a more modest DD cup. It wasn't about vanity, it was about regaining some sense of control over my body and my self-image. It was a way for me to feel like myself again. Slowly, my mental health began to improve. I could look in the mirror again without immediately feeling disgusted by what I saw. My confidence started to rebuild, and for the first time in years, I could stand in front of a mirror and not break down. But little did I know my decision would come back to haunt me in the form of a coworker named Jill. Fast forward to a few years later, and I was working in an office environment at the age of 28. I had found a job in a relatively small office, and I was doing well, better than I had in a long time. I had developed close friendships with a few coworkers, and overall things were going well. Then, out of nowhere, Jill, a coworker I didn't know well, discovered that I had had breast implants. She overheard a conversation between me and a longtime friend from before my surgery. We were discussing an upcoming holiday, and my friend made a comment about how I might get funny looks on the plane because of my implants. Jill overheard this, and before I knew it, the entire office knew about my breast implants except for the reason behind them. The details about my cancer scare, the mastectomy, and the therapy were kept private. At first I didn't think much of it. People gossip. That's just part of office culture, right? But soon enough, Jill started making comments about my implants in front of others, often when I was in earshot. They weren't harmless jokes either. One day I overheard her referring to me as having more plastic than Barbie, and another time she called me fake in 2 ways. She even went so far as to call me a sack of silicone. These comments were hurtful, not just because they were rude, but because they were based on ignorance. Jill didn't know the full story. She didn't know about my cancer scare, my mastectomy, or my struggle with my appearance. I brushed it off at first, thinking I could handle it. But when Jill started making these remarks multiple times a week, at least 3 times a week, sometimes more, it became impossible to ignore. I would hear her snicker behind my back, or she would make these comments to others in front of me. It was unbearable, and I started feeling like I was walking into a hostile environment every day. The worst of it came during a lunch in the office break room. A few coworkers and I were sitting together eating and chatting. I mentioned something about being shallow in a light-hearted way, and Jill immediately jumped in with a biting remark. I froze. That was the moment I snapped. I had tried to be patient. I had tried to be understanding, but that was it. I had had enough. I stood up, my voice shaking but determined, and said, "Do you know why I have these?" I motioned to my chest. A few years ago, the doctors found potentially cancerous cells in my breast tissue. I had a mastectomy to remove the tissue and eliminate the risk. After the surgery, I was left with huge, ugly scars, and I went to a therapist because I couldn't look at myself without crying. The therapist sent me to a plastic surgeon who suggested implants to hide the scars, and that's what I did. I felt like I had dropped the mic. I was shaking with anger and frustration, but I was proud that I had finally stood up for myself. I grabbed my lunch and left the room, leaving Jill speechless. But what happened next wasn't what I expected. After that day, I started to hear mixed reactions from my coworkers. Some came up to me and offered their support, saying that they couldn't believe Jill had been so cruel. But others seemed to side with Jill, claiming that she was just joking around and that I was being overly sensitive. I knew I wasn't imagining the harassment, but the division in the office left me feeling isolated. Then the email came. HR wanted to speak with me about creating a hostile work environment. I was stunned. This was not how I imagined things would go. I knew that Jill, who had been friendly with Debbie in HR, would probably be the one to report me, but I was shocked that it had escalated this far. I called HR for clarification, and they confirmed that the complaint against me was for creating a hostile work environment. With my outburst, I felt my heart sink. I knew this wasn't right, but I also knew that without solid proof, I could be in serious trouble. I wasn't about to let Jill or Debbie get away with this. I started planning my counterattack. I revisited my contract and found a section that stated I had the right to request an impartial overseer if I felt that the person reviewing a complaint was biased. I photocopied the relevant page and highlighted the section that allowed me to request a new reviewer. I also started reaching out to my coworkers, those who had supported me when Jill was making her comments. I asked them if they would be willing to provide written statements detailing the harassment they had witnessed. To my surprise, about 20 people were willing to help. Some had witnessed Jill's comments directly, while others had been told about them. Some even had specific dates and quotes of what Jill had said. I collected all the letters, each one detailing Jill's repeated remarks about my appearance, my implants, and even other coworkers' looks. It became clear that Jill had a pattern of cruel comments toward others as well. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. The day of the HR interview, I walked in armed with a folder full of evidence, signed letters from coworkers, a photocopy of my contract, and a timeline of events. I was ready to present my case. The HR manager, Debbie, was already there. When I mentioned the right to an impartial overseer, she hesitated. But when I showed her the contract, she had no choice but to bring in a neutral third party. The meeting was tense, and I could feel the animosity in the room. Debbie was visibly angry, and I knew she had expected to get me fired. The questions they asked were often repetitive, trying to corner me into admitting that I had done something wrong. But I stood my ground, recounted the details of the harassment, and presenting the evidence. I explained that Jill had been making cruel remarks for months and that I had asked her to stop several times. When I mentioned that the lunchroom incident had been captured on CCTV, I knew they would have no choice but to investigate further. After the interview, I didn't know what to expect. I returned to my desk and prepared for the worst. But then one by one the coworkers who had written letters were called into HR. They were gone for about 10 minutes each, and it became clear that they were being interviewed about Jill's behavior. Finally, after hours of tense waiting, Jill was called in for her meeting. I could see her storming into HR looking furious. She came back to the office about 30 minutes later, and I could feel the tension in the air. She glared at me as she packed up her things, muttering to anyone who would listen that I had gotten her fired. She shoved her way into the elevator, and I just watched her go. At 5 p.m., I received an email from HR. My case was closed. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had witnessed Jill's cruelty and been too afraid to speak up. The next few days at work were quiet. Jill never returned to the office, and rumors spread that she had been let go. People treated me with more respect, and I could sense that the dynamics of the office had shifted. I had stood up for myself. In the end, I wasn't just fighting for my job. I was fighting for my dignity, my self-respect, and my peace of mind. It wasn't an easy battle, but I won, and it felt damn good. Update: after Jill's departure from the office, things were oddly quiet for a while. The tension in the air that had been there for months, the subtle undercurrent of hostility. It wasn't like things instantly became perfect or everyone started hugging it out, but there was a shift, a subtle acknowledgement that something had changed in the office culture. At first I was on edge. I was hyper-aware of people's behavior around me. Were they judging me? Were they whispering about me behind my back? But over the following weeks, I started to realize that the majority of my coworkers weren't treating me any differently. They were just. They spoke to me with respect. They smiled at me like they had before. They weren't whispering about my past, my surgery, or the whole ordeal that had gone down with Jill. It felt like I could breathe again. There was a newfound sense of calm that settled over me as well. I had stood up for myself. I had finally done something that, while terrifying, had restored my sense of self-worth. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a survivor, and it was a different kind of empowerment, one that was earned through hard, uncomfortable decisions, but one that, in the end, made me stronger. But there were still small ripples in the office, reminders of the fallout from Jill's exit. You see, Jill's behavior wasn't isolated. She had been a kind of office bully who had hidden her cruelty behind a veneer of camaraderie with management and HR. When she left, it left a void. And when that void was filled, some of the cracks in the office culture began to show. Some coworkers who had stayed neutral during the whole ordeal now started coming to me with stories about other things Jill had said or done over the years that hadn't made it into the official complaints. One coworker, Sarah, confessed that she had heard Jill make fat-shaming remarks about another colleague, and another person, Paul, told me how Jill had once belittled someone for wearing too much makeup in the office, calling her fake just like she had called me. It wasn't just me. Jill had been cruel to a lot of people, and now with her gone, those who had feared speaking out were slowly starting to open up. The more I heard, the more I realized how toxic her presence had been, and I wasn't the only one who had suffered under it. Others had simply never had the courage or the opportunity to stand up like I did. It was heartbreaking, but it was also empowering. It made me feel like I hadn't just done something for myself, I had helped change the dynamics of the office, even if just a little. About a week after Jill's departure, I was called into HR for a follow-up meeting. I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me feared they were going to somehow retroactively reprimand me for making waves or escalating the situation. I had heard rumors that HR wasn't exactly thrilled with how things had played out. They had done their due diligence, sure, but it was no secret that Debbie and a few others had been allies of Jill, and I couldn't help but wonder if there would be any lingering resentment toward me for the way things had gone down. But to my surprise, the meeting was different. It was cordial, professional, and almost sympathetic. "We just wanted to check in with you," said the HR manager, Rachel, who had been the neutral party during the investigation. "We know things have been tense, and we want to make sure you feel comfortable moving forward in your role here." I nodded, slightly taken aback by the genuine tone in her voice. I hadn't expected this kind of follow-up. "We've reviewed the situation thoroughly and we believe you acted in good faith. The fact that you took the time to document everything, the statements from your coworkers, and your willingness to address the issue in a professional manner really stood out. You handled a difficult situation with a lot of grace." I felt a lump in my throat. I hadn't expected any praise, especially after everything that had happened. But hearing this from HR, the very people who had been involved in the investigation, was like a validation I hadn't known I needed. "I appreciate that," I said quietly, my voice catching slightly. "It's just." Rachel smiled kindly, though I could see a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I think a lot of us feel for you," she said. "It's hard when you have to take a stand like that, especially when it feels like the whole office is watching you, but you weren't just fighting for yourself, really?" I asked, feeling a mixture of surprise and gratitude. I hadn't realized how many people had actually been affected by Jill's behavior. Rachel nodded. "Absolutely, a lot of people were afraid to speak up. You've inspired some of them to come forward about their own concerns, not just with Jill, but with other issues in the office. You may not have intended to start a wave, but you've set an example. That was all I needed to hear. That acknowledgement that I hadn't just been fighting for myself, but for a better work environment for everyone, was worth more than anything." We spent the rest of the meeting talking about the next steps in my role. It was clear from the conversation that they wanted to ensure I was supported moving forward, and they even offered to provide me with more formal training in leadership skills, should I be interested. It felt like the company was actually looking out for me, which was a pleasant surprise. After everything with Jill, I had expected some kind of backlash, but instead I felt like they genuinely wanted me to succeed. The weeks that followed were a mixture of normalcy and quiet reflection. The office returned to something resembling a calm rhythm. Jill's absence left an undeniable void, but it also allowed space for new opportunities. People who had been too intimidated to speak up before were now voicing concerns, discussing boundaries, and in some cases, it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I felt my confidence continue to grow. I was more outspoken now, more willing to assert myself when I felt uncomfortable. I had learned that sometimes it wasn't enough to just quietly endure. Sometimes you had to make noise, even if it was scary, even if it meant standing up for yourself when no one else was willing to. My relationship with my coworkers improved. Those who had supported me came to me with more regularity. We'd share lunch breaks, chat after meetings, and laugh together without fear of judgment. I didn't have to worry about someone making comments behind my back anymore. And slowly, the friendships I'd built in the office became more genuine, more rooted in mutual respect. Of course, the journey wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still occasional moments where someone would make a passing comment, or a situation would arise where I felt like I was being underestimated or dismissed. But now I knew how to handle it. I knew I had the power to speak up. I knew I had the power to change things. As for Jill, well, I heard through the grapevine that she had moved on. Some people said she was now working in a role where she didn't have the same level of influence over her coworkers, and the change seemed to have humbled her. Others said she was still trying to play the victim, painting herself as someone who had been wronged by me and by HR. It didn't matter much to me. Jill wasn't my problem anymore. I had moved on, and I was stronger for it. Sitting at my desk one afternoon, the sunlight streaming in through the windows, I realized just how much I had grown over the past few months. The woman who had walked into that office a year ago nervous, unsure, constantly shrinking from conflict was gone. In her place stood someone who had faced her fears head on, who had fought for her dignity and won. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need anyone to like me. What mattered was that I liked myself again. I had been through hell and back, but I was no longer defined by my scars or by the judgments of others. I was defined by my strength, my resilience, and my ability to stand tall in the face of adversity. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace with who I was.